Every war story tells you who fired the guns. Very few tell you who carried the gold. In 1938, the vaults of Europe were full. Deep beneath Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, Warsaw, Rome, and dozens of other cities, there were rooms that most citizens would never see. Concrete walls, steel doors, dim yellow lights flickering off stacks of bullion. Thousands of tons of gold bars, each stamped with a seal, a serial number, and a quiet promise that this metal represented the strength of a nation. By 1945, a huge part of that bullion was gone. Trains left capital cities loaded with gold and never arrived at their destinations. Vault doors were opened after liberation to reveal bare concrete and a few scattered dust lines where stacks of bars once stood. Some of the missing bullion turned up in salt mines, hidden tunnels, and hastily sealed caverns in the mountains. Some reappeared decades later in legal settlements and quiet transfers, and some has never been convincingly publicly accounted for at all. World War II is remembered as the deadliest conflict in human history. But beneath the tanks and bombers, it was also the greatest bullion heist the world has ever seen. Entire national reserves changed hands, personal treasures were stripped away, melted, and remade, and when the shooting stopped, the gold was still there. It had just moved. So the real question is simple and uncomfortable. When the dust settled, who actually ended up with Europe's gold? This is the gold dossier, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Gold isn't just a shiny metal. In the 1930s and 1940s, it was credible itself. A country's gold reserves determined how much it could borrow, how much it could import, and how seriously its currency was taken. When a government said its money was backed by something, this is what they meant: bars in the dark, somewhere under the streets. And in World War II, those bars moved like armies. If you follow the bullion trail long enough, the story stops being about heroes and villains and becomes something colder. Gold didn't disappear. It was transferred, laundered, melted, restamped, and folded into the balance sheets of whoever had the power to claim it. Some were returned, some were compensated, some were quietly absorbed and forgotten. It never left the system, it just changed owners. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the moment before the map of Europe began to tear itself apart, when the vaults were still full and the books still balanced. In the years between the First and Second World Wars, gold was treated as national armor. Central banks accumulated it as a shield against the crisis. France built up one of the largest gold reserves in the world. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy followed the same pattern. Even smaller states, like Poland or the Baltic countries, saw bullion as their last line of defense in a world that didn't feel stable or safe. Some of this gold was stored at home in national vaults. Some of it was shipped abroad to safe havens, like the Bank of England in London or the Federal Reserve in New York. There was also a newer player in the game, the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, created to help manage international payments and central bank cooperation. On paper, it all looked like a network of professional institutions working together, bound by rules and norms. The unspoken assumption was that central bank gold was sacred. Even in war, this was meant to be off limits. Armies might seize factories, railways, and ports, but the reserves of a central bank were supposed to sit behind a wall of professional courtesy and international law. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle did not share that assumption. It was fuel. The regime entered the 1930s with heavy debts, limited foreign exchange, and an aggressive plan to rearm as fast as possible. It needed imported raw materials, technology, and food. It needed ways to pay partners and suppliers who did not care about ideology. Those partners wanted hard currency and bullion, so every time the map of Europe changed color, every time a new capital fell under German control, there was another, quieter operation taking place: the race to the vault. The pattern repeated itself from Vienna to Prague, from Brussels to Amsterdam. In Austria, after the Anschluss of 1938, Germany took control of the Austrian National Bank and its reserves. In Czechoslovakia, after occupying Prague, German officials pushed to seize Czech gold held both at home and abroad. Sometimes they physically took whatever was still in local vaults. Sometimes they issued instructions, forcing central bankers to move gold held in foreign vaults into accounts controlled by the Reichsbank. This was the first stream of gold, monetary gold held by central banks and national treasuries, transferred at gunpoint or under political coercion. But it wasn't the only stream. A second one was far darker and far more personal. Wedding rings, jewelry, coins, family heirlooms, and even dental gold were taken from victims in ghettos, in concentration camps, and in extermination centers. The SS shipped these valuables to the Reichsbank in coded consignments. There, they were melted down, stripped of any trace of their origins, and blended into Germany's gold reserves. On a ledger, there was no difference between a bar cast from central bank reserves and a bar that contained melted rings from a murdered family. It was just another asset, another bar, another line item called gold. Gold from occupied central banks flowed in. Personal gold from victims flowed in. Foreign coins seized from banks and individuals flowed in. The Reichsbank processed it all, melted what needed melting, recast what needed recasting, and sent it back out into the world. The problem with stolen gold is that it has a history. Bars are stamped, coins are recognizable. Central banks keep track of their serial numbers and their holdings. If a bar taken from Dutch reserves mysteriously reappears intact in another country's vault, somebody might ask questions. So the Nazis did what criminals and states have always done when they want to erase a past. They destroyed the originals. Coins were smelted. Bars were melted and mixed. Stamps were erased. Metal was poured into new molds. Once that was done, the past was gone. What remained was just gold, anonymous, silent, and seemingly clean. But gold sitting in a Reichsbank vault was only useful up to a point. Germany needed to turn that metal into machines, oil, weapons, and raw materials. To do that, it turned to countries that were officially neutral central banks and private financial institutions in places like Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Turkey continued to trade with Germany throughout much of the war. Some took gold as payment for exports. Some handled transfers between German institutions and other partners. In the process, they became part of the laundering machine. On the surface, these transactions looked like normal, if morally uncomfortable, business. Gold came in, credit went out, payments were made. But historians later traced patterns showing that a portion of this gold almost certainly originated in occupied Europe, central banks, and from the property of murdered civilians. The bars that arrived had been melted and restamped, but the timing, the volumes, and the paper trails told their own story. So, by the middle of the war, Europe's gold had been scattered. Part of it remained under German control in hidden caches and Reichsbank vaults. Part of it sat in the reserves of neutral central banks. Part of it had been turned into foreign currency, into imports, into the fuel and metal that kept the war machine running. Part had already disappeared into private hoards, dark channels, and gray markets. Then Germany began to lose. As Allied forces pushed into the Reich from west and east, something interesting started to happen. The regime knew the end was coming, and it knew that gold in the right hands could buy survival. Orders were given to move bullion and valuables away from obvious targets. Gold and currency were loaded into trucks and trains and taken to mines, tunnels, and mountain strongholds believed to be safe from bombing and advancing troops. One of the most famous sites was a salt mine near the village of Merkers in Thuringia. U.S. troops arrived there in April 1945, after hearing rumors from locals. When they went down into the mine, they found rooms filled with gold bars, foreign coins, Reichsmarks, art, and personal valuables. Walls were lined with sacks and crates. It was a condensed image of the entire war economy, a mixture of state reserves, looted central bank bullion, and the stolen wealth of individuals. Similar discoveries were made elsewhere. Gold stored in other mines, in castles, and tunnels dug into hillsides. At the same time, Allied soldiers seized trains in transit, some carrying cash and bullion, others carrying the personal property of deported populations. The Hungarian gold train is one of the most striking examples. In the final months of the war, as Soviet forces advanced, Hungarian authorities working with the Nazis loaded the confiscated belongings of Hungarian Jews onto a long train. It was a rolling treasure house: gold, jewelry, art, silverware, carpets, religious artifacts, and currency. The train was meant to carry these valuables to safety, where they could be turned into assets for officials trying to escape the coming collapse. Instead, the train was intercepted by American forces in Austria in May 1945. What should have been a clear case of restitution became something murkier. Officially, the contents were to be handled in line with general Allied policies on property. In reality, much of it was sold, mismanaged, or used informally to furnish officers' quarters. Many original owners never saw their property again. For them, the war ended, but the accounting never did. By the end of 1945, Europe's gold story looked like a shattered mirror. Pieces of central bank reserves were piled up under American, British, and French control. Other pieces were in the vaults of neutral states that had grown richer in bullion terms during the conflict. Some pieces were simply gone, swallowed by chaos, corruption, or deliberate concealment. The Allies attempted to bring order to this chaos. In early 1946, they set up a framework to deal with the question of looted monetary gold. The idea was to collect recovered bullion into a shared pool and then compensate the countries whose central banks had been robbed. This effort became the Tripartite Commission for the Restitution of Monetary Gold, a joint project of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. On paper, the mission was simple: identify the gold that Nazi Germany had stolen from occupied central banks, recover as much of it as possible, and then redistribute it based on documented claims. In reality, it was a long, grinding process full of gaps and compromises. First, the Commission could only handle monetary gold, official reserves stolen from states. It did not cover private valuables, victim gold, or ambiguous cases like the Hungarian train. The suffering of individuals was pushed into other legal and political channels, where outcomes were often incomplete or delayed by decades. Second, there was not enough recovered gold to fully compensate everyone. The total pool of bullion available to the Commission was smaller than the losses claimed by occupied countries. In the end, most claimants received only a portion of what they argued had been taken from them. Justice, in the system, meant percentage. Third, the Commission had no direct power over neutral states. Gold that had been transferred to Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, or other neutral or non-occupied countries during the war was the subject of separate negotiations and pressure campaigns. That meant politics played a large role in how much was actually returned and how much remained quietly in place. The Commission worked for more than half a century, dealing with disputes, late discoveries, and symbolic restitutions. It was only formally dissolved in the late 1990s. By then, most of the story had solidified into a simple public narrative. Some gold was stolen, some was recovered, some was returned. The rest was lost to history. But gold doesn't just vanish, it changes owners. So who took Europe's gold? The obvious answer is that the Nazis did. Their regime systematically stripped central banks and individuals of their bullion and valuables. That is true, but it is not the whole story, because every bar they stole ended up somewhere else. The Third Reich seized the gold first, treating it as both war funding and a tool of domination. Neutral financial institutions helped launder and normalize that bullion, knowingly or unknowingly, turning tainted bars into respectable reserves and payments. When the war ended, Allied governments took physical possession of captured hoards and decided how much of that metal would be returned to its previous owners, and how much would fund reconstruction, reparations, or other state goals. And, at every stage, individuals found ways to peel off pieces for themselves. The missing portion, the gap between what was known to exist before the war and what was officially accounted for after, did not float into space. It was absorbed into national reserves that never publicly admitted the origins of their increase into private collections, into coins and bars bought and sold over counters in the decades that followed, into the anonymous flow of bullion that underpins international finance. For the families whose rings, coins, and heirlooms were melted down, and for the smaller states whose reserves were never fully restored, the books never truly balanced. Their losses became the world's quiet gain. And that is the deeper lesson. When systems are under existential stress, ownership becomes flexible. Legal rights give way to political necessity. Central bank vaults that were once untouchable suddenly become bargaining chips and spoils. Gold that was once national becomes available. The same pattern appears again and again. Value flows upward and inward toward whoever has the power to seize, to negotiate, and to write the final version of events. Gold is marketed as the ultimate safe haven asset. But history shows that its safety depends on who controls the doors to the vault. In stable times, gold is protection. In chaotic times, it is tempting. During World War II, Europe's gold moved toward power, from small states to great powers, from occupied nations to occupiers, from identified individuals to anonymous systems, from personal ownership to collective opaque pools. When you hear the phrase missing bullion, you might imagine mysterious trains, hidden caves, and unsolved treasure maps. The reality is less romantic and more unsettling. The missing gold is not a legend. It is, in many cases, simply the unacknowledged foundation under someone else's prosperity. War moves borders. It also redraws balance sheets. The question, who took Europe's gold, doesn't have a single villain's name at the end of it. It has a network. The state that stole it first, the institutions that processed it, the governments that redistributed it, and the individuals and entities that quietly benefited from the gaps. The guns fell silent. The treaties were signed. But the bullion stayed in the dark, stacked in new vaults, wearing new stamps, backing new promises. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.